The humid Charleston air hung heavy over Whitmore Plantation as Eleanor stood on the wraparound porch, her black mourning dress clinging to her slender frame. 3 months had passed since her husband's funeral, yet the weight of grief, and something far more complex, still pressed against her chest like a stone. At 26, Eleanor Whitmore had never expected to become a widow so young. Thomas had been 43 when the fever took him, leaving her with 800 acres of cotton fields, a grand antebellum mansion, and 137 enslaved souls whose lives now rested entirely in her hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fields where dozens of figures moved in rhythmic patterns, their voices carrying fragments of work songs on the breeze. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the iron railing as she watched them, a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had grown up on this plantation, had seen this same scene every morning of her life, yet lately something felt different, wrong. Mrs. Whitmore? The voice belonged to Jeremiah, the elderly house slave who had served her family for over 30 years. His weathered face bore the careful neutrality that all enslaved people wore when addressing their owners. "Mr. Caldwell is here to see you, ma'am." Eleanor's jaw tightened. Richard Caldwell owned the neighboring plantation and had been circling like a vulture ever since Thomas's death, offering to help manage her affairs with thinly veiled intentions of acquiring her land and her hand in marriage. "Tell him I'm indisposed," she said, not turning from the view. "Yes, ma'am, but he says it's about the cotton prices, says it's urgent business." Eleanor sighed, knowing she couldn't avoid Caldwell forever. The cotton market was indeed struggling, and as much as she despised the man's presumptuous advances, she needed to understand the economic realities facing her plantation. "Very well. Show him to the parlor. I'll be down shortly." As Jeremiah's footsteps faded into the house, Eleanor remained on the porch, steeling herself for another uncomfortable encounter. Her gaze drifted to the slave quarters, a row of small wooden cabins that housed the families who worked her land. Smoke rose from several chimneys where the women prepared the morning meal before heading to the fields. It was then that she saw him. Samuel emerged from one of the cabins, a leather-bound book tucked under his arm. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the careful way he moved, the straight line of his shoulders that spoke of quiet dignity despite his circumstances. At 24, Samuel was the son of Moses, one of Thomas's most trusted field hands. Unlike his father, Samuel had been taught to read and write by the previous plantation owner's daughter, a scandalous decision that Thomas had grudgingly allowed to continue. Samuel's education made him invaluable for keeping records and managing some of the plantation's administrative tasks, but it also made him dangerous in the eyes of many white Charleston residents. An educated slave was a threat to the natural order they fought so desperately to maintain. As if sensing her gaze, Samuel looked up toward the main house. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Eleanor felt something flutter in her chest, a sensation she quickly pushed down. Such thoughts were not only inappropriate, but dangerous for both of them. She turned abruptly and walked into the house, her heels clicking against the polished wooden floors. The interior of Whitmore Manor was a testament to Southern wealth. Crystal chandeliers, imported furniture, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who had built their fortune on the backs of enslaved labor. In the parlor, Richard Caldwell stood examining a silver tea service, his thick fingers running over the ornate engravings. He was a large man with a ruddy complexion and the soft belly of someone who had never worked a day in the fields he owned. "Eleanor, my dear," he said, turning with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you look pale. This burden of managing such a large operation is clearly taking its toll." "Mr. Caldwell," she replied coolly, taking a seat in the high-backed chair farthest from him. "Jeremiah mentioned you had urgent business regarding cotton prices." Caldwell's smile faltered slightly at her formal tone. "Indeed, the prices have dropped another 15% this month." Many of the smaller plantations are already talking about selling. It's a difficult time for a woman to be managing such complex affairs alone. Eleanor's hands folded carefully in her lap. I appreciate your concern, but Whitmore Plantation has weathered economic storms before. Of course, Caldwell said, moving closer. But Thomas had years of experience, connections in Charleston and Savannah. You, my dear, are navigating treacherous waters without a compass. The condescension in his voice made Eleanor's teeth clench. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Caldwell? A partnership, he said, his eyes gleaming. Combine our operations, your land with my expertise. It would be mutually beneficial. Eleanor understood the subtext perfectly. Caldwell wanted her plantation, and marriage was simply the legal mechanism to acquire it. Under South Carolina law, a married woman's property automatically became her husband's. I'll consider your proposal, she said, standing to signal the end of their meeting. Good day, Mr. Caldwell. His face darkened at the dismissal, but he maintained his facade of gentility. Of course. But don't wait too long, Eleanor. The vultures are circling, and not all of them will be as generous as I am. After he left, Eleanor remained in the parlor, staring out the window at the fields beyond. The weight of her situation pressed down on her, a young widow with no male relatives to protect her interests, surrounded by men who saw her inheritance as an opportunity to expand their own wealth and power. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. To her surprise, it wasn't Jeremiah who entered, but Samuel. He carried a ledger book and moved with the careful deference expected of his position, yet there was something in his bearing that suggested an inner strength that couldn't be broken. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice deep and carefully modulated. "I have the weekly production reports you requested." Eleanor's breath caught slightly. This was the first time they had been alone together since Thomas's death, and she was acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation. Yet she found herself reluctant to dismiss him immediately. "Thank you, Samuel," she said, accepting the ledger. Their fingers brushed briefly as he handed it over, and she felt that same flutter from earlier, stronger now. Samuel's dark eyes met hers for a moment longer than was proper, and she saw something there. Intelligence, compassion, and perhaps something else that made her heart race. "Will there be anything else, Ma'am?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor knew she should send him away, should maintain the proper distance between mistress and slave. Instead, she heard herself saying, "The cotton prices are falling. Mr. Caldwell seems to think the plantation is in danger." Samuel's expression remained carefully controlled, but she caught a flicker of something, concern perhaps, or calculation. "If I may speak freely, ma'am," he said slowly, "Mr. Caldwell has been buying up struggling plantations for half their value. His concern for your welfare may not be entirely altruistic." The observation was astute and dangerously close to insubordination. A proper Southern lady would have reprimanded him immediately for speaking so boldly about a white man's character. Instead, Eleanor found herself leaning forward slightly. "What would you suggest?" she asked, the question surprising them both. Samuel hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of speaking honestly. "The plantation is profitable, ma'am. The books show consistent yields, and the land is some of the richest in the county. With careful management and perhaps some modernization of methods, Whitmore could weather this economic downturn better than most." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the intelligence that Thomas had both valued and feared. "You've given this considerable thought." "Yes, ma'am. I care about what happens to this place, to the people here." The admission hung between them, loaded with implications neither dared voice. Eleanor realized that Samuel wasn't just talking about the plantation's financial success. He was talking about the welfare of the enslaved families who would be sold or separated if the plantation failed. "I see," she said softly. Perhaps we should discuss these modernization methods you mentioned. Samuel's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion of a future conversation, but he quickly composed himself. Of course, Mom, whenever it would be convenient for you. As he turned to leave, Eleanor called out, Samuel? He paused at the doorway. Yes, Mom? Thank you for your honesty. Something passed between them in that moment. An acknowledgement of a boundary crossed, a line blurred. Samuel nodded once and left, leaving Eleanor alone with her racing heart and the dangerous realization that she was beginning to see him not as property, but as a man. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on the cotton fields, where the enslaved workers continued their endless labor. Eleanor stood at the window, watching Samuel walk back toward the quarters, his shoulders straight, despite the weight of the world that rested upon them. She didn't yet understand the full implications of what was beginning to bloom between them, but she could feel it. A pull as dangerous as it was undeniable. In the rigid social structure of 1840 Charleston, such feelings could destroy them both. Yet as she watched Samuel disappear among the cabins, Eleanor found herself thinking not of the risks, but of the intelligence in his eyes and the gentle strength in his voice. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something other than grief and fear. She felt alive. 2 weeks passed before Eleanor found another excuse to speak privately with Samuel. The cotton harvest was approaching, and she genuinely needed to understand the plantation's operations better, but she couldn't deny the anticipation that quickened her pulse whenever she thought of their next conversation. The opportunity came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon, when she found him in the plantation office, a small building separate from the main house where Thomas had conducted business. Samuel was bent over a desk, carefully recording the day's cotton weights in his precise handwriting. Eleanor paused in the doorway, struck by the incongruity of the scene. Here was a man whose intelligence and education would have made him a respected member of society in any other circumstance, reduced to recording the profits of his own enslavement. Samuel, she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up immediately, setting down his pen and rising to his feet. Mrs. Whitmore, I didn't hear you approach. Please sit, she said, stepping into the small room. I wanted to discuss those modernization methods you mentioned. Samuel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion that he remain seated in her presence, but eventually settled back into his chair. Eleanor took the chair across from him, another breach of protocol that would have scandalized Charleston society. I've been reading about new cultivation techniques, Samuel began carefully, methods that could increase yield while requiring less intensive labor. As he spoke, Eleanor found herself captivated not just by his ideas, but by the passion in his voice. He described crop rotation systems, improved irrigation methods, and soil conservation techniques with the enthusiasm of a man who truly understood and loved the land. Where did you learn about these methods? Eleanor asked. Samuel's expression grew cautious. I've been corresponding with agricultural colleges in the north, through intermediaries, of course. The admission was dangerous. Enslaved people were forbidden from receiving mail, and the idea of a slave educating himself about agricultural innovation would be seen as a direct threat to the established order. That's quite resourceful, Eleanor said, her admiration evident in her voice. Mrs. Whitmore, Samuel said, his tone growing serious, I should clarify something. These improvements I'm suggesting, they would benefit everyone on the plantation, the enslaved families, the land itself, and yes, your financial position. But they would also require changes in how things are done. Eleanor leaned forward. What kind of changes? Better living conditions for the workers, adequate food and medical care. Perhaps even small plots of land where families could grow their own vegetables. Samuel's voice grew stronger as he spoke. Healthy, well-fed workers are more productive. It's not just moral, it's economical. The conversation was venturing into territory that made Eleanor's heart race for reasons beyond attraction. Samuel was essentially arguing for treating enslaved people as human beings deserving of basic dignity, a radical concept in their world. "And you believe this would improve productivity?" she asked. "I know it would," Samuel replied, his eyes meeting hers directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I speak plainly?" Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure she was prepared for what he might say. "The people in those cabins aren't just labor, they're families, mothers and fathers, children with dreams, elderly people with wisdom. When they're treated with basic humanity, they work not just from fear, but from investment in the outcome." The words hung between them, revolutionary in their simplicity. Eleanor had grown up seeing enslaved people as property, as part of the natural order of Southern society. But sitting here, listening to Samuel speak with such eloquence and compassion, she began to see the fundamental cruelty of that worldview. "You're asking me to see them differently," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to see them truly," Samuel replied. Their eyes met and held, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just attraction anymore, it was recognition. She was seeing Samuel not as her property, but as a man of remarkable intelligence and character who had been denied every opportunity that should have been his by right. "These improvements you're suggesting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they would require significant changes to how the plantation operates." "Yes, ma'am." "Changes that other plantation owners would view as dangerous." Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, they would." Eleanor stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the fields where the afternoon sun cast long shadows. She could see workers moving between the cotton rows, their movements efficient despite the oppressive heat. "Samuel," she said, without turning around, "what do you think of me?" The question surprised them both. Samuel was quiet for so long that Eleanor finally turned to face him. "Mrs. Whitmore, he began, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to answer honestly without overstepping bounds that could cost him his life. "Please," Eleanor said, "I want to know." Samuel took a deep breath. "I think you're a woman caught between the world you inherited and the person you're becoming. I think you have a good heart that's been taught to see evil as normal. And I think—" He paused, his voice dropping to barely audible. "I think you're brave enough to choose differently." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had never thought of herself as brave, quite the opposite. She felt trapped by circumstances, by society's expectations, by the weight of responsibilities she never wanted. "I don't feel brave," she admitted. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Samuel said gently. "It's acting rightly despite the fear." Eleanor moved closer to the desk, her heart pounding. "And what would be the right action here, Samuel?" He looked up at her, and she saw the same recognition in his eyes that she felt in her heart. They were no longer just discussing plantation management. They were talking about something far more dangerous and infinitely more important. "I think," Samuel said carefully, "that would depend on what kind of person you want to be and what kind of world you want to help create." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. Samuel immediately stood and moved to the window. "It's Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice returning to the careful neutrality of a slave addressing his mistress, "with several other gentlemen." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She quickly moved away from Samuel, putting proper distance between them, but her mind raced with worry about how their private conversation might be interpreted if discovered. "You should return to your duties," she said, her voice louder than necessary for the benefit of anyone who might be listening. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied, gathering the ledgers. As he passed her on his way to the door, he spoke quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore, please be careful. Mr. Caldwell is not a patient man." The warning sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. She watched Samuel leave, then quickly composed herself before walking back to the main house to receive her unwelcome visitors. Caldwell stood on the front porch with 3 other plantation owners, Marcus Beauregard, James Thornton, and William Ashford. All were wealthy, influential men who formed the backbone of Charleston's planter aristocracy. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said, forcing a smile, "to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "Eleanor, my dear," Caldwell said, his tone carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. "We need to discuss some concerning reports we've been hearing." Eleanor's blood chilled, but she maintained her composure. "Oh? What sort of reports?" "Reports about unusual activities on your plantation," Beauregard said, his cold eyes studying her face. "Slaves being given responsibilities above their station, improper fraternization between the races." The accusation hung in the air like a loaded gun. Eleanor realized that someone had been watching, reporting on her interactions with Samuel. In Charleston society, even the appearance of impropriety between a white woman and an enslaved man could result in violence, social ostracism, or worse. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Eleanor said, though her heart was racing. "I've been learning to manage the plantation's operations. Surely that's to be expected of a widow in my position." "Of course," Caldwell said smoothly. "But there are proper ways to conduct such business, ways that maintain the natural order of things." Thornton stepped forward, his voice carrying a barely concealed threat. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're here as friends, offering guidance, but understand that the community has certain expectations about how a plantation should be run." Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her. These men weren't just offering advice, they were delivering a warning. Step out of line, and there would be consequences. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully. "But I assure you, Whitmore Plantation operates within all proper bounds." "I'm sure it does," Ashford said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Perhaps it would be wise to have more experienced oversight to ensure that continues to be the case." The threat was clear: submit to their control or face the consequences of defying Charleston's social order. As the men finally departed, Eleanor stood on the porch watching their carriages disappear down the oak-lined drive. The Spanish moss, hanging from the ancient trees, seemed to whisper warnings in the humid breeze. She thought of Samuel's words about courage being action despite fear. Looking out at the slave quarters, she realized she was standing at a crossroads that would define not just her future, but the futures of everyone on the plantation. The choice before her was becoming clear, even as the dangers multiplied. She could submit to men like Caldwell, accept a marriage that would strip away her independence and reduce her to a decorative ornament in someone else's life. Or she could choose a different path, one that led toward an uncertain future, but offered the possibility of something real and meaningful. As the sun set over the cotton fields, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would find Samuel again. And this time, their conversation would be about more than just plantation management. It would be about the courage to choose love over safety, humanity over convention, and truth over the comfortable lies that held their world together. Eleanor barely slept that night. She lay in her four-poster bed, staring at the ceiling while moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the room. Every creak of the old house seemed amplified. Every sound from the slave quarters carried on the night breeze felt significant. By dawn, she had made her decision. She found Samuel at sunrise, working alone in the plantation's vegetable garden behind the slave quarters. He was tending to the tomato plants, his movements careful and precise as he tied the growing vines to wooden stakes. The early morning light caught the definition of his shoulders beneath his worn cotton shirt, and Eleanor felt that familiar flutter in her chest intensify. "Samuel," she called softly, not wanting to wake the family still sleeping in the nearby cabins. He turned, surprise flickering across his features when he saw her. It was highly unusual for the plantation mistress to venture into this area, especially so early in the morning. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said, straightening and wiping his hands on a cloth. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor approached slowly, acutely aware that they were more alone than they had ever been. The slave quarters were quiet, most of the workers still preparing for the day ahead. "I need to speak with you," she said, "about yesterday, about what Mr. Caldwell and the others said." Samuel's expression grew serious. "Ma'am, if I've caused you any trouble—" "You haven't," Eleanor interrupted. "But I think we both know that our conversations have been noticed." Samuel nodded grimly. "Yes, ma'am. I suspected as much." Eleanor moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the scent of earth and morning air that clung to his skin. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to know that I don't regret our conversations. In fact, they've been the most meaningful exchanges I've had since Thomas died." Something shifted in Samuel's expression. Surprise, hope, and something deeper that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "what are you saying?" Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would cross a line from which there might be no return. "I'm saying that when I look at you, I don't see property. I see a man of intelligence and character who has been denied every opportunity he deserves. I see someone who understands this land and these people better than any of the so-called gentlemen who came to lecture me yesterday." Samuel's eyes widened, and Eleanor could see him struggling to process her words. "And," she continued, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it, "I see someone who makes me feel more alive than I have in years." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared cross. Samuel stared at her, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and fear. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "you don't understand what you're saying, what this could mean for both of us." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor replied, stepping even closer. "I understand that what I'm feeling is dangerous. I understand that society would condemn us both. But I also understand that I can't continue pretending I don't feel it." Samuel's hands clenched at his sides, and Eleanor could see the internal battle raging within him. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I've felt it too. God help me, I've felt it too." The confession broke something open between them. Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand, and the contact sent electricity through both of them. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. Before Samuel could answer, the sound of voices from the slave quarters interrupted them. The morning routine was beginning, and soon the area would be bustling with activity. "We can't talk here," Samuel said urgently, glancing toward the cabins. "It's too dangerous." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. "The old tobacco barn, the one by the creek. Meet me there tonight after the evening meal." Samuel hesitated, clearly understanding the magnitude of what she was suggesting. A clandestine meeting between them would be the ultimate transgression, one that could result in his death and her complete social destruction. "Eleanor," he said, "if we're discovered—" "I know," she said, "but I also know that I can't live the rest of my life wondering what if." Samuel studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Tonight," he agreed. Eleanor turned to leave, then paused. "Samuel, yesterday you said courage was acting rightly despite fear. What if society is wrong about what's right?" Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "Then I suppose we have to decide whether we're going to live by society's rules or by our own conscience." Eleanor nodded and walked back toward the main house, her heart racing with anticipation and terror in equal measure. She had just arranged a secret meeting with an enslaved man, a meeting that could destroy them both. Yet for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly alive. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor went through the motions of her daily routine, reviewing household accounts, meeting with the overseer, responding to social correspondence, but her mind was entirely focused on the evening ahead. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Eleanor made her excuses to the household staff and retired to her room early. She waited until the plantation had settled into its nighttime quiet, then slipped out through the kitchen door, her heart pounding with each step. The old tobacco barn stood at the edge of the property, near a creek that wound through a grove of ancient oak trees. It had been abandoned for years, used now only for storing old equipment and supplies. Eleanor had chosen it precisely because it was isolated, unlikely to be visited by anyone after dark. Samuel was already there when she arrived, standing in the shadows near the barn's entrance. The moonlight filtering through the trees cast dappled patterns across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. "You came?" Eleanor said, though she realized immediately how foolish the words sounded. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Samuel replied, stepping closer. Eleanor shook her head, suddenly feeling nervous and uncertain. Now that they were here alone in the darkness, the magnitude of what they were doing hit her with full force. "Samuel," she began, "I need you to understand something. That is, with Thomas, our marriage was an arrangement," Samuel finished gently. "I understand." Eleanor looked up at him, grateful for his perception. "Yes, an arrangement. I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you." Samuel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't, his fingers gently touched her cheek, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the tenderness of the gesture. "Eleanor," he said, "I need you to be sure. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. Not for either of us." Eleanor covered his hand with hers, pressing it against her cheek. "I'm sure," she whispered. Samuel's other hand came up to frame her face, and Eleanor felt herself drowning in the intensity of his gaze. When he leaned down to kiss her, she met him halfway, their lips coming together with a passion that had been building for weeks. The kiss was everything Eleanor had never experienced, tender yet urgent, gentle yet consuming. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Eleanor," Samuel whispered against her forehead, "I love you. I know I have no right to say it, but I do." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming emotion. "You have every right," she said fiercely, "and I love you too." They held each other in the moonlight, both understanding that they had just changed everything. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But as they stood there, lost in each other's arms, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the oak trees. Richard Caldwell had suspected something was amiss, and tonight his suspicions had been confirmed. As Eleanor and Samuel finally parted, promising to meet again the following night, Caldwell slipped away into the darkness, his mind already working on how to use this information to his advantage. The lovers had found each other, but their secret was no longer safe. The storm that would soon engulf them was already gathering, and when it broke, it would test not only their love, but their very survival. 3 weeks passed in a haze of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Eleanor and Samuel met every few nights at the abandoned tobacco barn, their relationship deepening with each encounter. They talked for hours about everything: literature, philosophy, their dreams for a different world. Samuel shared stories of his childhood, of learning to read by candlelight while his mother kept watch. Eleanor spoke of her loneliness in her marriage, of feeling like a beautiful ornament in Thomas's grand design rather than a partner. Their physical relationship had grown as well, slowly and tenderly, with Samuel always careful to ensure Eleanor felt safe and cherished. For the first time in her life, Eleanor understood what it meant to be truly desired and loved for who she was, not what she represented. But their secret was becoming harder to maintain. Eleanor found herself humming while she worked, smiling at unexpected moments, and taking more interest in the welfare of the enslaved families on the plantation. She had quietly implemented several of Samuel's suggestions, improving the food rations, allowing families small garden plots, and ensuring better medical care. The changes were subtle but noticeable to anyone paying attention, and Richard Caldwell was definitely paying attention. On a humid Tuesday morning, Eleanor was reviewing the plantation's books in the main house when Jeremiah announced that Caldwell had arrived for an unscheduled visit. Eleanor's stomach clenched with apprehension, but she composed herself and went to receive him in the parlor. Caldwell stood with his back to her, examining a portrait of Thomas that hung above the fireplace. When he turned, his smile was cold and calculating. "Eleanor, my dear," he said, "you look radiant lately, positively glowing." The comment sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. "Thank you, Richard. To what do I owe this visit?" "I've been thinking about our previous conversation," Caldwell said, settling into a chair without being invited, "about the challenges facing your plantation. I believe the situation has become more urgent than we initially discussed." Eleanor remained standing, unwilling to settle into what felt increasingly like a trap. "Oh? In what way?" Caldwell's eyes glittered with malice. "There have been more reports, Eleanor. Disturbing reports about the management of your property. Some of the neighboring plantation owners are beginning to question whether a woman alone can maintain proper discipline." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Eleanor said, though her heart was racing. "Don't you?" Caldwell stood and moved closer, his bulk intimidating in the confines of the parlor. "Reports of slaves being given privileges above their station, of improper familiarity between the races, of a certain educated Negro who seems to have gained unusual influence over the plantation's operations." Eleanor's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Mr. Caldwell, if you have specific concerns about how I manage my property, I suggest you state them plainly." Caldwell's smile widened, and Eleanor realized with growing horror that he was enjoying this. "Very well," he said. "I have it on good authority that you've been meeting privately with one of your slaves. A young man named Samuel, I believe, meeting with him in circumstances that would be considered scandalous if they became public knowledge." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. Someone had seen them. Someone had been watching, waiting, gathering evidence. "That's a serious accusation," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Indeed it is," Caldwell agreed. "The kind of accusation that could destroy a woman's reputation entirely. The kind that could result in a slave being sold to the most brutal plantation in Georgia, or worse." The threat was clear and devastating. Eleanor realized that Caldwell held their lives in his hands, and he was savoring every moment of her fear. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "What I've always wanted," Caldwell replied. "A partnership. Marriage, Eleanor. Your plantation combined with mine, under proper male management. Your indiscretions forgotten and forgiven." Eleanor stared at him, understanding the full scope of the trap he had laid. Marry him or watch Samuel die and her own reputation be destroyed. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then I'm afraid I would be compelled to share what I know with the community, for their own protection, of course. We can't have dangerous ideas spreading among the slave population." Eleanor's mind raced, searching for options, for any way out of the corner Caldwell had backed her into, but she could see none. In the rigid social structure of Charleston, a white woman accused of improper relations with a slave had no defense, no recourse. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Of course," Caldwell said magnanimously. "But don't take too long, my dear. Secrets have a way of becoming harder to contain the longer they're kept." After he left, Eleanor collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking. She had to warn Samuel, had to find a way to protect him, but she also knew that any attempt to communicate with him now would only provide Caldwell with more evidence. That evening, Eleanor paced her bedroom like a caged animal, desperate to meet Samuel at their usual place, but knowing it was too dangerous. She had to find another way to reach him, to warn him of the danger they faced. The opportunity came the next morning when she saw Samuel working in the plantation office. She approached casually, as if conducting normal business, but her heart was pounding. "Samuel," she said quietly, "we need to talk, but not here, not at our usual place. It's not safe." Samuel looked up from his ledgers, immediately sensing the urgency in her voice. "What's happened?" "Caldwell knows," Eleanor whispered. "He's been having us watched. He's threatening to expose us unless I marry him." Samuel's face went pale, and Eleanor saw fear flicker in his eyes, not for himself but for her. "Eleanor, you have to accept his proposal," Samuel said urgently. "You have to protect yourself." "No," Eleanor said fiercely. "I won't sacrifice you to save myself." "You don't understand," Samuel said, his voice desperate. "If this becomes public, they won't just sell me. They'll make an example of me. And you, Eleanor, they could charge you with crimes that carry severe penalties." Eleanor knew he was right. In South Carolina, sexual relations between a white woman and a black man was not just socially taboo, it was illegal, punishable by imprisonment or worse. "There has to be another way," she said. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "There is one way," he said. "I could run. Head north, try to reach the free states." "No," Eleanor said immediately. "The risks are too great, and even if you made it, I'd never see you again." "Eleanor," Samuel said gently, "that might be the only way to keep us both alive." Before Eleanor could respond, they heard footsteps approaching the office. Samuel immediately returned to his work, and Eleanor stepped back, putting proper distance between them. But as Jeremiah entered to announce another visitor, Eleanor caught Samuel's eye and saw the same determination there that she felt in her own heart. They would find a way. They had to. But that night, as Eleanor lay sleepless in her bed, she felt a new sensation. A subtle change in her body that made her blood run cold with realization. She was late. Her monthly courses, which had always been regular, were now more than a week overdue. Eleanor pressed her hands to her stomach, her mind reeling with the implications. If she was pregnant with Samuel's child, it would be impossible to hide for long. And when the truth came out, it would mean certain death for Samuel and complete ruin for herself. The stakes of their love affair had just become infinitely higher. As the clock in the hallway chimed midnight, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She would not let Caldwell destroy the man she loved, and she would not bring a child into the world only to watch its father die. Tomorrow, she would begin planning their escape. It was dangerous, perhaps impossible, but it was their only chance at a future together. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel they were an omen of the tempest about to engulf them all. Eleanor's suspicions were confirmed a week later when the plantation's doctor, summoned under the pretense of treating a persistent headache, delivered the news she both feared and secretly hoped for. "Congratulations, Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Harrison said, packing his medical bag. "You're with child. About 6 weeks along, I'd estimate." Eleanor managed to maintain her composure until the doctor left, then sank into a chair, her hands instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. A child. Samuel's child. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had to tell Samuel, but their opportunities for private conversation had become increasingly limited. Caldwell's deadline loomed. He had given her 2 weeks to accept his proposal, and only 3 days remained. That evening, Eleanor made a desperate decision. She sent word through Jeremiah that she needed Samuel to review some urgent financial documents in the main house after the evening meal. It was risky, but she had no choice. Samuel arrived at the appointed time, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert to the danger of meeting in the main house. Eleanor led him to Thomas's former study, a room at the back of the house where they were less likely to be overheard. "Eleanor," Samuel said as soon as the door closed, "this is too dangerous. If someone sees—" "Samuel," Eleanor interrupted, "I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a physical blow. Samuel staggered backward, his face cycling through shock, joy, and terror. "Are you certain?" he whispered. Eleanor nodded. "Dr. Harrison confirmed it today, about 6 weeks." Samuel sank into a chair, his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with anguish. "Eleanor, this changes everything. You have to marry Caldwell now. It's the only way to protect yourself and the child." "No," Eleanor said fiercely. "I won't let him claim our child as his own. I won't live that lie." "Then what?" Samuel asked desperately. "Eleanor, when people realize the timing, when they see the child—" Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit plantation grounds. "We run," she said quietly. "We take what money I can access and head north. Together." Samuel was quiet for so long that Eleanor turned to face him. His expression was one of profound sadness. "Eleanor," he said gently, "do you understand what you're suggesting? A white woman traveling with a black man? Even in the north, we'd face suspicion, hostility. And if we're caught before we reach free territory—" "I know the risks," Eleanor said, "but what's the alternative? Watch you die. Raise our child to believe Caldwell is its father." Samuel stood and moved to her, taking her hands in his. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "A more dangerous way, but one that might give us a real chance." Eleanor looked up at him, hope flickering in her chest. "What do you mean?" "There are people," Samuel said carefully. "People who help slaves escape to freedom. They call it the Underground Railroad. I've heard whispers, rumors of safe houses and routes north." Eleanor's eyes widened. She had heard vague stories of abolitionists who aided runaway slaves, but she had never imagined they might be her salvation. "You think they would help us?" she asked. "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "A white woman choosing to flee with a slave. It's not a situation they've likely encountered before, but there's someone who might know. Moses, my father. He's been on this plantation longer than anyone. If there are connections to be made, he would know about them." Eleanor nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "How do we approach him?" "Carefully," Samuel said, "and soon. Caldwell's deadline is approaching, and once you refuse his proposal, he'll act quickly to destroy us both." Before Eleanor could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching the main house. Samuel immediately moved away from the window, and Eleanor's heart began to race. "It's Caldwell," Samuel said grimly, recognizing the sound of the man's distinctive carriage. "With others." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. A late-night visit from Caldwell, accompanied by other men, could only mean trouble. "You have to go," she whispered urgently. "Use the back stairs. Slip out through the kitchen." Samuel hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her to face whatever was coming alone. "Go," Eleanor insisted. "If they find you here—" Samuel nodded reluctantly and moved toward the door, but before leaving, he turned back to her. "Eleanor," he said, "whatever happens tonight, know that I love you. Both of you." He was gone before Eleanor could respond, slipping out of the study like a shadow. Eleanor quickly composed herself and went to the front parlor to receive her unwelcome visitors. Caldwell stood on the front porch with 3 other men, Sheriff Morrison, Judge Whitfield, and Marcus Beauregard. The presence of law enforcement and judicial authority made Eleanor's stomach clench with dread. "Gentlemen," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "this is quite late for a social call." "This isn't a social call, Mrs. Whitmore," Sheriff Morrison said grimly. We're here on official business." Eleanor's heart pounded, but she maintained her composure. "What sort of official business?" Judge Whitfield stepped forward, his expression stern and unforgiving. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have received credible reports of improper conduct on your plantation, conduct that violates both social norms and state law." "I'm afraid I don't understand," Eleanor said, though she understood perfectly. Caldwell's smile was triumphant and cruel. "Eleanor, my dear, there's no point in pretending. We have witnesses who have observed your inappropriate relationship with one of your slaves." Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "That's a serious accusation," she said. "I hope you have more than rumors and gossip to support it." "We do," Sheriff Morrison said. "Mr. Caldwell has provided sworn testimony about what he observed. We also have statements from other plantation workers who have witnessed improper familiarity between you and the slave called Samuel." Eleanor realized with growing horror that Caldwell had been thorough in building his case. He had not only watched them himself, but had also pressured or bribed other slaves to provide testimony against them. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Whitfield said, "under South Carolina law, sexual relations between a white woman and a Negro slave constitute a serious crime. If these allegations are proven true, you could face imprisonment, and the slave in question would face execution." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain standing. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. Caldwell stepped forward, his expression magnanimous, but his eyes cold. "Eleanor, I'm prepared to be merciful. Marry me, and these unfortunate allegations can be overlooked. The slave will be sold to a distant plantation, and we can put this unpleasantness behind us." Eleanor looked at the four men arrayed against her, representatives of the law, the church and social order that had shaped her entire world. They held all the power, all the authority. By every measure of the society she had grown up in, she should submit to their demands. Instead, she thought of Samuel's words about courage being action despite fear. She thought of the child growing inside her, and the kind of world she wanted that child to inherit. "No," she said clearly. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Caldwell's face darkened with rage. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "you're making a grave mistake." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied, "but it's my mistake to make." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm placing you under house arrest, pending a formal investigation. You are not to leave this property or communicate with the slave in question." Eleanor nodded, understanding that her refusal had set events in motion that could no longer be stopped. As the men prepared to leave, Caldwell lingered behind. "This isn't over, Eleanor," he said quietly. "You have one more chance to reconsider. But if you continue down this path, I will destroy you both." After they left, Eleanor stood alone in the parlor, her hands shaking with the magnitude of what had just occurred. She was now under official suspicion, her movements restricted, her communication monitored, but she had made her choice. Now she had to find a way to warn Samuel and begin planning their escape before Caldwell's net closed around them completely. Outside, storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened, sending rain lashing against the windows. Eleanor couldn't help but feel that the tempest was just beginning. Eleanor spent a sleepless night pacing her bedroom, her mind racing through possible escape plans. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would have to trust Moses, Samuel's father, and hope that the rumors of the Underground Railroad were more than wishful thinking. The challenge was making contact. Sheriff Morrison had stationed 2 deputies on the plantation grounds, ostensibly to maintain order but actually to monitor Eleanor's movements. She was effectively a prisoner in her own home. The opportunity came during the morning meal preparation. Eleanor approached Jeremiah in the kitchen, speaking quietly, while the other house servants bustled about their duties. "Jeremiah," she said, "I need you to deliver a message to Moses. Tell him I need to speak with him urgently about agricultural matters." Jeremiah's weathered face showed no emotion, but Eleanor caught the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He had served the Whitmore family for decades and was astute enough to read between the lines. "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. "I'll see that the message is delivered." An hour later, Moses appeared at the kitchen door, hat in hand, playing the role of a dutiful slave, reporting for instructions. Eleanor met him in the pantry, where they could speak without being overheard. Moses was a man in his 50s, his hair graying but his bearing still strong. His resemblance to Samuel was unmistakable, the same intelligent eyes, the same quiet dignity that no amount of oppression could break. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "Jeremiah said you wanted to discuss agricultural matters." Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing she was about to trust this man with all their lives. "Moses," she said quietly, "I need your help. Samuel and we're in terrible danger." Moses's expression didn't change, but Eleanor saw his hands tighten slightly on his hat. "I know about you and my son," he said simply. "I've known for weeks." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. "You knew?" "A father knows when his son is in love," Moses replied, "and when that love is dangerous." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the gentle acceptance in his voice. "Moses, they're going to kill him, and I'm carrying his child." Moses closed his eyes briefly, and Eleanor saw the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Not long," Eleanor said. "Caldwell has given me until tomorrow to accept his marriage proposal. When I refuse, he'll move against Samuel immediately." Moses nodded slowly. "There are people who can help," he said. "But it's dangerous, more dangerous than you can imagine." "I understand," Eleanor said, "but what choice do we have?" Moses studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he made his decision. "There's a woman named Ruth who runs a safe house about 20 miles north of here. She's helped others reach freedom. But Mrs. Whitmore, you need to understand, once you start down this path, there's no turning back. You'll be leaving everything behind forever." Eleanor thought of the grand house around them, the plantation that had been her family's legacy for generations, the social position that had defined her entire life. "I understand," she said. "When can we leave?" "Tonight," Moses said. "It has to be tonight. Tomorrow will be too late." Eleanor's heart raced at the speed with which events were moving, but she knew Moses was right. Every hour they delayed increased the danger. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Moses outlined the plan quickly. Eleanor would need to gather whatever money and jewelry she could carry, along with essential supplies. At midnight, she would slip out of the house and meet Samuel and Moses at the old tobacco barn. From there, they would travel on foot through the swamplands to avoid the main roads, making their way to Ruth's safe house. "Mrs. Whitmore," Moses said before leaving, "I want you to know what you're doing for my son, the sacrifice you're making. I've never seen him as happy as he's been these past weeks. Whatever happens, you've given him something precious." Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks. "He's given me something precious too," she whispered. The rest of the day passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor went through the motions of her normal routine, all while secretly preparing for their escape. She gathered what money she could access from Thomas's safe, along with her mother's jewelry and a few essential items of clothing. As evening approached, Eleanor's nerves stretched to the breaking point. She dined alone, as had become her custom since Thomas's death, while the deputies maintained their watch outside. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow potentially threatening. At 11:30, Eleanor made her move. She had dismissed the house servants early, claiming fatigue, and now the main house was quiet. She slipped out through the kitchen door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard across the plantation. The night was overcast, which provided cover but made navigation difficult. Eleanor made her way carefully across the grounds, staying in the shadows of the oak trees and avoiding the areas where the deputies might be patrolling. Samuel and Moses were waiting at the tobacco barn, along with another figure Eleanor didn't recognize, a woman of middle age with kind eyes and calloused hands. "This is Ruth," Moses said quietly. "She's going to guide us to the first safe house." Ruth studied Eleanor with sharp, assessing eyes. "You sure about this, child?" she asked. "Once we start walking, there's no going back." Eleanor looked at Samuel, seeing the love and concern in his eyes, and felt the flutter of life growing within her. "I'm sure," she said. Ruth nodded. "Then we best get moving. We have a long way to go before dawn." They set off into the darkness, following Ruth through paths that seemed invisible to Eleanor's untrained eyes. The older woman moved with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times before, leading them through dense undergrowth and around treacherous patches of swampland. Eleanor had never walked so far in her life. Her soft leather boots, designed for parlor floors and carriage rides, were soon soaked through and rubbing blisters on her feet. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Samuel's life and their child's future depended on reaching safety. After what felt like hours, Ruth finally called a halt near a small creek. They were deep in the swamplands now, surrounded by cypress trees draped in Spanish moss that created an otherworldly landscape in the moonlight. "We rest here for a few minutes," Ruth whispered, "but stay quiet. Sound carries in the swamp." Eleanor sank gratefully onto a fallen log, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Samuel immediately moved to her side, his face creased with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. The physical demands of their escape were unlike anything she had ever experienced, and she was acutely aware of the child growing inside her. "How much farther?" she whispered to Ruth. "About 5 more miles," Ruth replied. "But the hardest part is still ahead. We have to cross the main road and there are patrols." Eleanor's stomach clenched at the mention of patrols. She knew that runaway slaves were hunted with dogs and armed men, and the penalties for those who aided them were severe. As if reading her thoughts, Ruth continued, "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand something. If we're caught, I can't protect you. Your best chance would be to claim you were kidnapped, forced to come along against your will." Eleanor shook her head immediately. "I won't abandon Samuel to save myself." Ruth's expression softened slightly. "I hoped you'd say that, but I had to give you the choice." They resumed their journey, moving even more carefully now as they approached the dangerous road crossing. Eleanor could hear her heart pounding in her ears as they crept through the underbrush toward the edge of the tree line. Ruth held up a hand, signaling them to stop. In the distance, Eleanor could hear the sound of horses approaching, a patrol making its rounds. They crouched in the darkness, barely breathing, as the riders passed. Eleanor felt Samuel's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own in silent support. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Ruth motioned them forward. They darted across the open road like shadows, Eleanor's heart racing with terror at their exposure, but they made it safely to the other side, disappearing once again into the protective darkness of the forest. The final miles to the safe house tested Eleanor's endurance to its limits. Her feet were bleeding now, and exhaustion made every step an effort of will. But the thought of the life growing inside her and the man she loved walking beside her gave her strength to continue. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached their destination, a modest farmhouse nestled in a clearing, smoke rising from its chimney in the early morning light. To Eleanor, it looked like paradise. Ruth led them to the back door, where they were met by a stern-faced woman in her 40s who introduced herself simply as Mary. "You made good time," Mary said, ushering them inside. "But we can't stay long. Word is already spreading about the search." Eleanor's blood chilled. "They're looking for us already." Mary nodded grimly. "Caldwell discovered you were missing before midnight. He's got every available man searching the roads and questioning anyone who might have seen you." Samuel's face went pale. "How long before they think to search this area?" "Not long," Mary admitted, "which is why you need to keep moving. There's another safe house about 30 miles north, closer to the Virginia border. If you can reach it, you'll have a better chance." Eleanor felt despair wash over her. 30 more miles seemed impossible in her current condition. "I don't think I can make it," she admitted quietly. Mary studied her with experienced eyes, taking in Eleanor's exhausted state and the way she unconsciously protected her stomach. "You're with child," Mary said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded, too tired to dissemble. Mary's expression softened. "How far along?" "About 6 weeks," Eleanor replied. Mary exchanged a meaningful look with Ruth. "That changes things," she said. "You need rest and proper care, not another forced march through the wilderness." "But if we stay here, we'll be caught," Samuel said desperately. Mary was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing their options. When she spoke, her voice was decisive. "There's another way," she said. "More dangerous in some respects, but it might be your best chance. There's a ship leaving Charleston harbor tomorrow night, a merchant vessel bound for Philadelphia. The captain is sympathetic to our cause." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You're suggesting we go back toward Charleston?" "Sometimes the best place to hide is where no one expects to find you," Mary replied. "Caldwell and his men will be searching the roads north. They won't expect you to double back toward the city." Samuel shook his head. "It's too risky. If we're recognized—" "You won't be," Mary said. "We have ways of disguising people. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll travel as the widow of a northern merchant, returning home after settling your husband's affairs. Samuel will be your manservant. Free papers can be arranged." Eleanor felt a spark of hope for the first time since their escape began. "You think it could work?" "I think it's your best chance," Mary replied. "But you need to decide quickly. If you're going to make it to Charleston by tomorrow night, you need to leave within the hour." Eleanor looked at Samuel, seeing her own mixture of hope and terror reflected in his eyes. They were being offered a chance at freedom, but it required walking directly back into the heart of danger. "What do you think?" she asked him quietly. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the possibilities and risks. "I think," he said finally, "that sometimes the most dangerous path is also the only path to freedom." Eleanor nodded, her decision made. "Then we go to Charleston." As Mary and Ruth began preparing for their journey, Eleanor felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. They were still in terrible danger, still facing an uncertain future. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like they had a real chance. The storm that had been building around them was far from over, but perhaps, just perhaps, they might find their way through it to the other side. The journey back toward Charleston required a complete transformation. Mary worked with practiced efficiency, dyeing Eleanor's distinctive auburn hair a mousy brown and providing her with the somber clothing of a northern widow. Samuel was given the papers of a freed slave named Joseph, along with a letter of employment from Eleanor's fictional deceased husband. "Remember," Mary instructed as they prepared to leave, "you're Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, recently widowed, returning to Philadelphia after settling your husband's cotton trading business. Samuel is Joseph, your loyal servant who has been with your family for years. You're traveling together because you trust him to protect you on the dangerous journey north." Eleanor practiced the story until it felt natural, while Samuel studied his forged papers with the intensity of a man whose life depended on memorizing every detail, which in fact it did. They traveled by wagon for the first part of the journey, hidden beneath sacks of grain, while a sympathetic farmer transported them closer to Charleston. The irony of returning to the very city where their troubles began was not lost on Eleanor, but she understood the wisdom of Mary's plan. Caldwell's search efforts would be focused on the roads leading away from Charleston, not toward it. As they approached the city's outskirts, Eleanor felt her anxiety spike. Charleston was a relatively small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. The risk of being recognized was enormous, but their disguises proved effective. Eleanor, with her dyed hair and modest clothing, looked nothing like the elegant plantation mistress who had graced Charleston's social events. Samuel, carrying himself with the careful deference of a servant, attracted no unusual attention. They took rooms at a modest inn near the harbour, Eleanor registering as Mrs. Morrison, while Samuel was given quarters in the servants' area. The separation was painful, but necessary to maintain their cover. That evening, as Eleanor sat alone in her small room, she felt the full weight of what they had sacrificed. Everything she had known, her home, her social position, her very identity, was gone forever. She was now a fugitive, carrying the child of a man society considered her property, betting everything on the hope of reaching a place where their love might be allowed to exist. A soft knock at her door interrupted her melancholy thoughts. Eleanor opened it to find Samuel, his face creased with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, glancing down the hallway to ensure they weren't observed. Eleanor pulled him into the room, closing the door behind him. "I'm scared," she admitted, falling into his arms. Samuel held her tightly, his own fear evident in the tension of his body. "I know," he whispered, "but we're so close now. Tomorrow night we'll be on that ship." Eleanor pulled back to look at his face. "Samuel, what if this doesn't work? What if we're caught?" Samuel's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away tears she didn't realize she was crying. "Then we'll face whatever comes together," he said. "Eleanor, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that loving you has been worth every risk." Eleanor felt her heart break and soar simultaneously. "I love you too," she whispered. "Both of you," she added, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. They spent the night holding each other, finding comfort in their closeness, while the sounds of Charleston's harbour drifted through the window, ships creaking at anchor, sailors calling to each other, the splash of waves against the docks. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor remained in her room, playing the part of a grieving widow who preferred solitude. Samuel moved about the inn and harbour area, gathering information about their ship and watching for any signs of pursuit. As evening approached, Eleanor's nerves stretched to the breaking point. Their ship, the Northern Star, was scheduled to depart at midnight. Captain Williams, the vessel's master, had been contacted through the Underground Railroad network and had agreed to take them aboard for a substantial fee, most of Eleanor's remaining money. At 11 o'clock, Eleanor and Samuel made their way through Charleston's darkened streets toward the harbour. Eleanor's heart pounded with every step, expecting at any moment to hear Caldwell's voice calling her name, or to see Sheriff Morrison emerging from the shadows. But they reached the docks without incident. The Northern Star was a modest merchant vessel, its holds loaded with cotton bound for Philadelphia's textile mills. Captain Williams met them at the gangplank, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand its injustices. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, tipping his hat, "I understand you need passage to Philadelphia." "Yes, Captain," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My servant and I are eager to return home." Captain Williams nodded, but Eleanor caught the meaningful look he exchanged with Samuel. The captain understood exactly what he was risking by taking them aboard. "Very well," he said, "we'll have you in your cabin shortly. We depart within the hour." As they boarded the ship, Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and terror. They had made it this far, but the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. If they were discovered now, there would be no escape. The cabin Captain Williams provided was small but clean, with a narrow bunk and a tiny porthole that looked out over Charleston Harbour. Eleanor stood at the window, looking back at the city where she had spent her entire life, knowing she would never see it again. Samuel joined her at the porthole, his arm coming around her waist. Together they watched the lights of Charleston grow smaller as the Northern Star made its way out of the harbour and into the open ocean. "No regrets?" Samuel asked quietly. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "None," she said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As the ship sailed north through the darkness, Eleanor felt the child flutter within her, the first movement she had been able to detect. She placed Samuel's hand on her stomach, and they both felt it, a tiny kick, as if their baby was announcing its presence and its determination to be born free. 3 days later, the Northern Star docked in Philadelphia. Eleanor and Samuel disembarked as husband and wife. The captain had performed a simple ceremony during the voyage, declaring them married in the eyes of God, if not the law. Philadelphia was a revelation. For the first time in their lives, they walked the streets together openly, without fear or shame. There were still challenges ahead: finding work, establishing new identities, building a life in a place where they knew no one. But they were free. Eleanor found work as a seamstress, her fine needlework skills serving her well in her new life. Samuel used his education and agricultural knowledge to find employment with a progressive farming operation outside the city. They rented a small apartment in a neighborhood where mixed-race couples, while still uncommon, were not unheard of. 6 months later, their daughter was born, a beautiful child with Samuel's dark eyes and Eleanor's delicate features. They named her Hope, for the future they had dared to imagine and fight for. As Eleanor held her daughter for the first time, with Samuel beside her and sunlight streaming through the windows of their modest home, she thought about the price they had paid for this moment. They had lost everything they had known, everyone they had loved, every comfort and security they had possessed. But looking into Hope's eyes, Eleanor knew it had been worth it. Their daughter would grow up free, in a world where love was not a crime, and where the color of one's skin did not determine the limits of one's dreams. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand, Eleanor would tell her the story of how she came to be. A story of courage and sacrifice, of love that refused to be bound by society's chains, of two people who chose each other over safety and comfort. It was a story that began with scandal and tragedy, but ended with hope and freedom. And in the end, Eleanor thought, that was the only kind of story worth living. The storm had passed, and they had found their way to calmer waters. Together, they had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their old lives, a family bound not by law or convention, but by love and choice, and the unshakable belief that all people deserved the chance to be free. In Charleston, the Whitmore plantation eventually fell into ruin, its fields returning to wilderness. Richard Caldwell never found another opportunity quite as lucrative, and he spent his remaining years bitter and diminished. The enslaved families who had worked the land were sold to other plantations, their fates lost to history. But in Philadelphia, in a small apartment filled with laughter and love, Eleanor and Samuel built a new world, one where their daughter could grow up believing that love was stronger than hate, that courage could overcome fear, and that freedom was worth any price. It was a lesson Hope would carry with her throughout her life, and one she would pass on to her own children in turn. The legacy of Eleanor and Samuel's love would endure long after the society that had tried to destroy them had crumbled into dust. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all.